For 40 years, my hands did not shake. Not once, not with a stopped heart cupped in my palm, not with a child's life measured in the seconds before I closed. So when I tell you that my hands began to tremble at a kitchen table at midnight, over nothing more dangerous than a telephone, you will understand that something had gone very wrong in the one place I never thought to guard. It was the night before my grandson turned 16. Elliot was asleep down the hall, and I was doing the small, dull, loving thing a guardian does when sleep won't come, making sure the money was ready. His tuition came due in 3 days. So I opened the college fund on my phone, the account I had fed patiently for 16 years, first with his dead parents' hands and then with mine, and I went to move it the way I had moved it a dozen quiet times before. $430,000. The balance read 0. I did not shout. 4 decades over open chests teaches a man that the first thing you feel in a catastrophe is the thing that kills the patient. So I sat still and I refreshed the screen. Right account. Right date. The number did not blink. Somewhere in the last 5 weeks, my grandson's entire future had drained out of that account in careful, patient increments, and the final withdrawal had cleared that very afternoon, while the boy and I ate dinner, and I asked him what kind of cake he wanted. Beneath the emptied ledger sat a notification I didn't recognize, a little envelope from an address I had never seen. I opened it, and it was a glossy, automated thank you note. On behalf of the Hartwell Legacy Fund, we thank you for your continued confidence, Doctor. There was a link. Against every instinct a careful man owns, I pressed it. A website bloomed open, clean and expensive, and reassuring in the way only expensive lies are. At the top was a photograph of me, a real one, taken at a hospital gala 3 years back, my own tired smile looking back at me from the glass. Beneath it, in elegant type, Dr. Silas Hartwell, founding advisor. And under that, a short video, with a play button resting over my own face, like a coin on a dead man's eye. I pressed it, and I heard myself speak. My voice warm, certain, the exact voice I had used for 40 years to tell frightened people their surgery had gone well, was telling strangers on the internet that I had personally vetted this fund, that I trusted it with my own family's future, that I invited my dearest friends and my former patients to place their savings beside mine. 30 seconds of me, saying words I had never once said, in a recording I had never made, warm and calm and utterly convincing. I set the phone face down on the table, and I noticed my hand was not steady, and I made it be steady, and I turned the phone back over and watched it a second time. I was listening now the way I used to listen to a heart, not to the words, but to the rhythm underneath them. And there, buried in the warmth, so faint that only a man who had spent his life listening for the skip would ever catch it, was a tiny wrong beat, a breath drawn in the wrong place, a word that did not quite sit against the word before it. Somebody had built me out of pieces. Somebody had learned to make me say anything they wanted. My name is Dr. Silas Hartwell. I am 68 years old, and for 40 years I was a cardiothoracic surgeon. And there is no sound on this earth I know better than a human heart telling the truth or telling a lie. Before I take you one stitch further into how I took this man apart, do one thing for me. Tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from, and subscribe, because you are going to want to see every second of how a heart surgeon closes a wound like this one. I sat there a long time with my dead wife's kitchen clock ticking over my head, and I made myself say the 3 facts out loud. In order, the cold, sequential way I once read a dying rhythm off a monitor. The money was gone. My name and my face and my voice were on the theft, and I had not made that recording, which meant the person who did was someone close enough to study me for years, someone I would never in 1,000 nights have thought to suspect. I only realized how close when I stood up to pour the cold coffee down the sink, and I glanced, out of 15 years of habit, at the shelf by the door, where Odette's silver stethoscope had hung since the day she died. The shelf was empty, and at 6 the next morning, before I had decided what to do about any of it, my phone rang and it was him, warm and even and smiling, with no skip in his voice at all, calling to invite me to a gala Thursday night, where 300 people were going to hand him the last of their savings, and where, he said, he wanted to honor me. Tiếp tục hoàn thiện. Cùng một với beat 1, hai nối liền mạch từ đoạn hook mới, dùng tên Elliot. CM 1 mở màn. Tiếp, beat 1, 2. Let me tell you who I am, so you understand exactly what kind of man they decided to hollow out and wear like a coat. I spent 40 years inside the human chest. I trained in an era when heart surgery was still half nerve and half prayer, and I stayed at the table long enough to watch it become a precise and beautiful science, but the essential act never changed in all that time. You open a person at their most vulnerable core. You find the one thing that is quietly killing them, the thing hidden under all the healthy tissue that looks fine on the surface, and you repair it before the clock runs out. I have held a heart that had stopped and felt it shudder back into rhythm under my fingers. I have told a mother her daughter would live to see her own children. I have also, 3 times in 40 years, had to walk into a waiting room and tell a family the truth they had been praying not to hear, and I learned very young that a surgeon who cannot bear to deliver bad news honestly has no business holding a blade. Comfortable lies kill people in my profession. I built my whole life on the opposite of them. My wife Odette died 4 years ago. 41 years married. She had been a cardiac nurse when I met her, and she could read a heart monitor faster than any resident I ever trained. She used to catch the skip a full second before the machine alarmed. In her last weeks, when the cancer had moved into her, and we both knew, she would still glance at her own telemetry from the hospital bed and tell me, dry as ever, exactly how much time the numbers were giving her. She was right. She was always right about the rhythm of things. Years before, on an anniversary, I'd had a silver stethoscope engraved for her OH, her initials, curled against the bell, and it hung on the shelf by our door until the day she died. And it had hung there every day since. Until, I now understood, sometime in the last few weeks, it had not. Remember that stethoscope. It is going to matter more than you think. My son and his wife died 2 years after Odette. A rain-slick highway, a guardrail, a phone call at 2 in the morning that no father should ever have to answer. They left one child behind. Elliot, 16 as of tomorrow, grave and kind and frighteningly bright. With his grandmother's ear for the moment, a thing goes off-key. He can hear a wrong note in a song from the next room. He gets that from Odette. He did not get it from me, though God knows I spent my life listening for wrong notes in other people's chests, and somehow never heard the one sounding in my own house. I became the boy's guardian, and standing in a funeral home 2 years ago, I made my dead son a promise into the empty air where he should have been standing, that his boy would want for nothing, and would be cheated by no one ever. That promise is very nearly the only religion I have left. You should hold on to that fact too, because everything I am about to do in this story, I did in the keeping of it. And into my life, 15 years ago, long before the worst of the grief arrived, had come a young financial advisor named Rowan Merrick. You cannot measure a betrayal without first measuring the trust it grew inside of, so let me measure it for you honestly. Rowan managed my money for 15 years. He came to the anniversary dinners and sat at Odette's table. He sent Elliot a card on every single birthday, in his own hand. When Odette was dying, and I could not make my mind hold a column of numbers, Rowan handled all of it, gently, and he never once sent me a bill for those months. When my son died, it was Rowan who sat in my kitchen at 3 in the morning and helped me build the guardianship accounts with his own hands. The very accounts I would later understand that he had already begun to plan how to empty. I trusted that man the way you trust a scrub nurse who has stood across the table from you for 15 years and has never once, not one time, slapped the wrong instrument into your open palm. Here is the thing I know that other men do not. A lie has an arrhythmia. A lie does not beat evenly. There is always a skipped beat somewhere in it, a flutter, a small compensatory pause where the plain truth should have been and isn't. You only have to know where to rest your fingers to feel it jump. For 40 years I felt that skip in the chests of strangers, and for 15 years I had, so to speak, rested my fingers on Rowan Merrick's pulse across 100 lunches and dinners and late-night phone calls, and I had never once felt it skip, which left me, at that kitchen table, with only two possibilities. Either the arrhythmia in him was new, some recent rot, some fresh desperation that had turned a good man, or there had never been anything wrong with his rhythm at all, because a truly gifted liar doesn't skip, and I had been listening to the wrong heart, contentedly, for 15 years. I want you to understand precisely why I did not call the police that night, because the reason is the whole cruel architecture of what these men do, and it is the same architecture whether they come for your grandmother or for you. My face was on the website. My voice was in the video. If the Hartwell Legacy Fund was a fraud, and the zero in Elliot's account told me beyond any doubt that it was then to every stranger who ever looked, I was the fraud. I was the trusted old surgeon, lending his spotless name to the scheme, reassuring the marks with his own warm voice. If I picked up the phone at midnight and cried out that I had been robbed, the very first thing any investigator would find was $430,000 of my own grandson's money flowing into a fund that carried my name and my endorsement. And the second thing they would find was a video of me, smiling, personally asking people to invest. I would not be the victim on the report. I would be the suspect at the center of it. You do not close a wound before you have traced the full length of the tear. Odette taught me that in a different language, 40 years ago, watching over my shoulder in an operating theater. Don't suture in a hurry, Silas. Rush the closing and you trap the bleeding inside, where you can't see it and can't reach it, and it kills them slow while everything looks fine on top. Rush this, and I would suture myself inside it. So I did the patient thing. I photographed the website screen by screen, in the dark. I saved the video. I mapped every transfer out of Elliot's account and saw that they had begun exactly 5 weeks ago, and grown faster each week, the way a failing rhythm accelerates in the last minutes before it collapses into nothing. Something was building. Something was gathering speed toward a specific point. Then I went and stood in the doorway of my grandson's room and watched him sleep, 16 years old, his whole clean future quietly stolen out from under him by a man who had signed his birthday cards. And I let the rage come all the way up, all the way to the top, the way you let a patient's chest fill before you make the cut. And then, deliberately, the way I had done 10,000 times in my life before scrubbing in, I set it down. A surgeon who operates in anger buries the patient. The boy did not need my fury. He needed my hands to be steady, and my head to be cold, and my eye to find the one hidden thing that was killing us before the clock ran out. Here is the paradox I have carried every day since that night, the one that still finds me awake at 3 in the morning. I have restarted 1,000 hearts that stopped on my table, and I could not hear the single heart beating a lie that had been sitting across from me at dinner for 15 years. I slept 2 hours. At 6 the phone rang, and it was Rowan, warm and even and smiling down the line with no skip in his voice at all, which told me, finally and completely, exactly how good a liar I had been trusting with my whole life. He said the word gala. He said the word honor. He said they wanted me in the spotlight, the founding advisor. A few words to the room. I stood at the table where the number had read 0, and I made my voice sound old and pleased and grateful. Rowan, I said, I'd be honored. I would be there Thursday night. I would stand in his light, in front of every soul he was about to rob, and I would let the man who had learned to counterfeit my voice hear, at last, what the real one sounded like when it finally told the truth. But not yet. First, I had to see how far the tear ran. And to measure a tear like that, you have to let the man holding the knife go on believing the patient is still asleep. Tima hai fat hiatem 0, doided u. Beat Basau. Rowan Merrick's office occupied the top floor of a glass tower downtown, and I had not set foot in it in 3 years. Because for a long time he had come to me house calls. He used to joke, for his most important patient. When the elevator opened that Monday morning, I understood at once that the joke had always run the other way. The reception wall was a shrine, and I was the saint. There I was, blown up 4 feet tall in a black and white portrait, Dr. Silas Hartwell, founding advisor. There I was again in a framed magazine spread I had never given an interview for. And there, Mounted in a shadow box under museum glass at the center of it all, catching a little spotlight of its own, hung a silver stethoscope with the initials OH curled against the bell. Odette's stethoscope. My dead wife's, engraved for our anniversary, taken off the shelf by my own door, and hung on this man's wall, like a relic, a borrowed piece of a good man's soul, pinned up to make the whole operation smell of trust. A brass plaque beneath it read, "A legacy of care." I stood in front of it, and I did not let my face do anything at all. 40 years of walking out of failed surgeries into full waiting rooms had taught me how to carry a face like a still surface over deep water. But I made myself a small, cold promise in front of that glass case, the same way I had once promised my son in an empty funeral home. I am taking that back before this is over, and I am taking it back myself. Silas. Rowan came out with both hands extended, warm as ever, silver at the temples now, expensive in a way that 15 years ago he had not been. "You should have let me come to you. I wanted to see the operation," I said, and let him take it as fondness. He walked me through it in his corner office, in that unhurried, reassuring voice. And I let him, because a man explaining his own scheme to a mark he believes is harmless will tell you things no wiretap ever could. He called it a fund of funds. "A feeder," he said, gathering capital from sophisticated investors and placing it with a larger strategy managed above him. He waved a hand vaguely upward, towards some higher floor of the money, and I filed that gesture away without a flicker. My name, he explained gently, was simply the heart of it. People trusted a doctor. People trusted me. I was, he said, the founding advisor, the face of care. All I had ever had to do was be myself and let good returns speak for themselves. He said returns the way a man says a word he has said 10,000 times without ever once meaning it. I nodded along, an old man flattered by his own portrait on the wall. And then, when he had finished, I set the hook I had come to set. "Rowan," I said, and let a small tremor into it. "I went to move Elliot's tuition this weekend, and I must have done something foolish with the account. The balance came up wrong. I'm sure it's me." But it gave me a fright. I watched him the way I watch a monitor. And Rowan Merrick was good God. He was good. He did not skip. His face moved through concern to gentle understanding with the smooth, even rhythm of a healthy pulse. And he came around the desk and put a hand on my shoulder, and he said the thing I already knew he would say, because it is the thing they always say. "Silas, soft, sorrowful. I've been meaning to talk to you about this, and I hate that it's like this." He sighed. "You authorized those transfers yourself, into the fund. A few weeks ago we did it together, on the phone. You were so excited to put Elliot's money where yours was." A pause, perfectly placed. "You don't remember." He said it not as a question but as a diagnosis. And then, gently, as if it grieved him, he turned his monitor toward me and played me a recording. My own voice, warm and certain, authorizing the transfer of my grandson's college fund into the Hartwell Legacy Fund, naming the amount, thanking Rowan, laughing even, at the end. I had never made that call. I will tell you honestly what happened inside me in that moment, because it is the exact thing these men are counting on, and you should know the shape of it before it ever happens to you. For one full second, listening to myself say words I had never said, in a voice indistinguishable from my own, I felt the floor of my certainty drop away. Did I? Am I sure? The dates blur. Odette used to say grief eats the memory. My son's death, the guardianship, the long nights did I, in some exhausted moment, pick up the phone and, that is the whole engine of it. They do not merely steal from you. They make you doubt the one instrument you have always trusted absolutely, your own mind. They turn your grief into the weapon and hand you the diagnosis of your own decline. But I have opened 10,000 chests, and my hands never once shook over a beating heart, and they would not shake now. I reached for the one fixed fact I had. I do not misremember whole conversations. I have never in 40 years written a false note in a chart. And that voice on his monitor and made myself listen to it, not as a frightened old man, but as a surgeon listening for the skip, that voice drew a breath in a place a living man never would. The fog cleared. I let my shoulders sag anyway, and my eyes go wet and confused, and I gave him what he wanted. "You're right," I said. "You're right. The dates get away from me. Thank God you're watching it for me, Rowan." The relief in that room was a living thing, and in the black reflection of his darkened monitor, as he turned back to it, I watched Rowan Merrick glance across the room at a sleek woman in a gray suit, standing by the door, his compliance officer. He'd called her. Delphine and I watched the two of them share a look. Not cruel, worse than cruel. Satisfied. The easy, professional look of two people watching a difficult piece of cargo settle safely into the hold. And I heard the soft chime of Delphine's tablet as she sent something VIP invitations away. She murmured, and it landed in my ear, precisely like a heart monitor beeping its steady, reassuring, entirely counterfeit rhythm over a patient who is already, quietly, bleeding out inside. I let Rowan walk me to the elevator with his arm around my shoulders. I let him tell me how much Thursday's gala would mean to everyone. I looked once more on the way out, at Odette's stethoscope under its museum glass, and I said nothing, and the doors closed. That night I did not sleep. I sat in my study with the lamp off, and the city glowing cold through the window, and I held in my hands the old stethoscope I kept in my desk, my own, the working one, its rubber gone stiff with age, and I let the grief and the fury rise all the way up one more time, and then I set them down, because panic is the enemy of a clear field. That was another of Odette's, though she stole it from me first. A clear field, Silas. You cannot repair what you cannot see, and you cannot see through your own blood. I sat in the dark until my pulse came down to a slow, even sounding, until the frightened, grieving grandfather went below, and the other man came quietly up, the one who had brought a 4-year-old off the table, when the whole room had already given up, because he refused to call the rhythm dead while his fingers could still feel it. The surgeon in me woke up, and the surgeon looked at the whole case with cold and total clarity, and saw it entire. They had built something elegant, a voice they could counterfeit at will, a recording to prove I had consented, a diagnosis in waiting. The poor old doctor, memory going, doesn't recall what he authorized, ready to explain away anything I said, so that the more I protested the theft, the more I proved their story. My own good name spread over the whole scheme like healthy tissue over a tumor, so that anyone who cut into it would cut into me first. If I stood up in the open and shouted, I would be the ranting, declining old man, and every word out of my mouth would be another beat of evidence for exactly the failing mind they had already recorded. You do not attack a tumor like that from the surface. You wait. You let it declare itself. You choose the moment when the field is clear and the whole thing is exposed, and then you cut once, cleanly, all the way to the root. They wanted to prove my mind was failing. Very well. I would let them believe it. I would let them believe it right up until Thursday night, when they had gathered everyone they meant to rob into a single lit room and put a microphone in the failing old man's hand. They wanted to operate on me, so I would let them open me up in front of 300 witnesses, and I would be awake the entire time watching every move they made, with my own steady hand already resting on the blade beneath the drape. The performance began the next morning, and I want you to understand what it cost me, because a proud man does not spend his dignity cheaply, and I spent all of mine on purpose over the following days, in front of the one man who had watched me closely for 15 years. I began to fail, gently and convincingly, in exactly the places a man like Rowan Merrick would expect an old surgeon's mind to go soft first. Not the medicine, never the medicine, but the money. I called him and asked the same question about a statement twice in 1 week. I let him find me confused about which account was which. I signed, with a trembling hand and profuse thanks, a broadened advisory authorization that gave him wider control over my remaining assets, and as I signed it I said, in a small and tired voice, the sentence that turned his patience into greed, I'm too old to keep track of all this anymore, Rowan. You handle it. I trust you with everything. You and Elliot are all I've got. I watched that land. I watched a man who had spent 15 years being careful decide at last that he no longer needed to be. It is a particular thing to hand a thief the last lock and watch him stop checking over his shoulder. From his side of the desk, it must have looked like the current had finally carried the frail old doctor exactly where he wanted him. From mine, I had just requested a transfer into the center of his operation, with a spotlight and a microphone waiting for me at the end of the week. But before I let the week carry me to Thursday, I did one more thing, and it was the most dangerous small thing I did in the whole affair. I asked to hear the recording again. That call I made, authorizing Elliot's transfer, I said, sheepish, apologetic. Would you play it once more? I want to try and remember making it. It frightens me that I can't. Rowan, who found this touching, predators always find their victims' grief touching. Right up until it becomes the blade, played it for me a second time. And this time I did not listen as a frightened man. I closed my eyes and I listened the way I had listened to 10,000 hearts, for the beat that falls where no living beat should. And I heard it. 3 of them, in fact. There was a breath drawn inward in the middle of a phrase where a speaking man would have been breathing out a splice, a seam where 2 recordings had been sewn together. There was a word, Elliot's, that sat a half-tone wrong against the words on either side of it, as though it had been lifted from another sentence entirely and set into this one, which of course it had. And under all of it, faint as a murmur behind a strong first heart sound, ran a thin mechanical evenness, a smoothed-out quality that no human throat produces, the ghost signature of a machine that had learned my voice and was now performing it. It was a forgery, not of a signature of me, of the actual sound of my living voice. A wrong beat, stitched into a counterfeit heart. I said nothing. I let one real tear fall. That part required no acting, and I told Rowan I still couldn't remember, and I thanked him, and I went home carrying, for the first time, the shape of the specific thing I needed. Not testimony, not suspicion, but the physics of a lie. If a machine had made that voice, a machine had left a seam in it, and a seam can be found and measured and shown, in a lit room, to 300 people, on a screen. But I could not find that seam alone, and so I began, quietly, to assemble a crew. The first man I called was Idris Magnuson. 11 years ago, Idris Magnuson had come into my operating theater as a code, a securities investigator in his 50s, whose heart had simply stopped at his desk mid-investigation, brought to me blue and pulseless, with the odds already written off. I had opened his chest and put my hand around his stopped heart, and refused, for a long time, to call it long past the point where a reasonable man would have, because his rhythm kept flickering under my fingers, like a candle that would not quite go out. He lived. He retired 2 years later, and he had spent the decade since telling anyone who would listen that he owed me the back half of his life, and I had spent that decade waving him off. When I told him, over the phone, what had been done to me and to my grandson, there was a long silence on the line. Then Idris Magnuson said, in a voice I imagine he'd once used across interrogation tables, Silas. A voice deepfake in a feeder fund solicitation. Do you understand what you've actually stumbled into? That's not one thief. That's a whole pyramid, and your face is on the door of it. Tell me everything, and touch nothing. The second call was to Priya Sundaram, a securities attorney of terrifying precision who had handled Odette's small foundation for years and had never once, in all that time, lost a fight she chose to enter. She listened to the whole of it and then said only, if they synthesized your voice to solicit investment, Silas, then they haven't just committed fraud. They've handed us a physical artifact that can be proven false in a courtroom. Do nothing to warn them. Let them keep believing you're theirs. Which was, more or less, the instruction I had already given myself, but a man fighting for his grandson's future is steadied to hear it come back in the mouth of someone who wins. And the third ally, I did not recruit at all. She found me. Her name was Marguerite, and she was Rowan's staff accountant, a tired, careful woman in her 40s, a single mother, the person who reconciled the books that made the pyramid look like a business. I had met her twice in passing. I did not know, until she asked to speak with me alone in the parking garage beneath his tower, that she had been watching me perform my careful decline all week, and had not for one moment believed it. "You're not confused," she said, low, her keys tight in her fist. "I've watched you sign things this week that no confused man signs. And I've watched him watch you." She looked away. "There's a feeder above us. A man named Cassius Lowell. Rowan owes him more than there is money in the world, and the only way to pay Cassius is to keep bringing in new names, and the best new name Rowan ever found was yours. I've been reconciling ledgers for 2 years that I know are lies, because I have a daughter, and I told myself it wasn't my crime." Her voice did not hold quite steady. "My father was talked out of his retirement by a man exactly like this. He died still apologizing to us for it, like it was his fault. I can't do it again. I have access to everything. The feeder ledgers, the investor list, the wire schedule. Tell me what you need." I looked at this frightened, decent woman who had decided, at real cost, to stop being furniture in another man's crime, and I understood that I now had, quietly assembled around me, exactly the crew I needed. A hunter who knew pyramids, a lawyer who did not lose, and an insider with the keys. Over the days that followed, I let Rowan tighten every knot himself. I confirmed, in my small, tired voice, that I would speak at Thursday's gala. I let him coach me on what to say, how grateful I was to the investors, how proud I was of the fund that bore my name, how much my late wife would have loved to see this legacy of care. I let him hang a founding advisor's medal around the whole thing. Through Marguerite, I learned that the gala was not a celebration at all, but a closing the final capital raise, the night the largest new investments would be committed, after which, though she did not yet know the timing, the money would move. And every evening I gathered my crew. Idris began pulling the threads of Cassius Lowell and the structure above Rowan. Priya began, very quietly, drafting. Marguerite began photographing ledgers, and I began, at last, to go through the one asset none of them yet knew I possessed. But that is a thing for the next tide, and I will come to it. Rowan believed the operation was closed and dressed and ready to celebrate. He believed he had brought the difficult old doctor safely into the fold, put his good name over the whole scheme, and needed now only to stand him up in the light on Thursday and let him bless the room. He had spent 15 years being careful, and he had, at the very end, forgotten the first thing I ever learned at a table. The most dangerous moment in any operation is not the crisis. It is the moment just after, when the numbers steady and the room relaxes and the surgeon, satisfied, begins to close and never once thinks to look again at the quiet, harmless-looking tissue he has already decided is dead. They had handed me a microphone and a spotlight and a room full of every soul they meant to rob. They had just scheduled their own autopsy and invited me to hold the blade. The evidence came to me in 3 tides over the days before the gala, each one higher and colder than the one before it, and by the time the third had gone back out again, I understood that I had badly underestimated how deep the water ran beneath my grandson's stolen future. The first tide was Rowan's own phone. Idris Magnuson had a young contact, a network technician who had once, years ago, been quietly saved from a career-ending mistake by a report Idris chose not to file, and who now paid that debt the way people in my story tend to. He did not touch Rowan's phone. He did not need to. He cloned it, mirrored its traffic through a gap in the building's own network that Rowan had paid a great deal of money to believe was secure, and 2 mornings before the gala, Idris laid a transcript across my kitchen table with the care of a man laying out an instrument tray. There, in Rowan Merrick's own words, was the whole shape of it. A string of messages to a contact saved only as C.L. Cassius Lowell. Rowan reporting, deferential, almost frightened. The doctor was cooperating, the doctor would speak, the closing was on schedule, and Cassius answering, cold and brief. Good. Close the round at the gala. Everything commits that night. We move it before the weekend. And then Rowan, alone, to no one, a note to himself that the mirror had caught. After Thursday, I never have to smile at that old man again. There it was. The confession, unforced, in his own hand. The old man he had smiled at for 15 years, whose dead wife's stethoscope hung on his wall under museum glass, a thing to be endured until Thursday, and then discarded. I read it twice and set it down. Grief is a hemorrhage, and I had a field to keep clear. The second tide was Marguerite's ledgers, and it was the one that turned my stomach, because it was not numbers, it was names. She slid the photographed feeder list across the table, and I recognized them. Not strangers, mine. Half the investor list was people I knew, former patients whose hearts I had held in my hands, colleagues, 2 men I had gone to medical school with, a widow from my own church, whose husband I had operated on twice. Rowan had not merely used my face on a website. He had walked, with my counterfeited blessing, straight down the list of every person who trusted Dr. Silas Hartwell, and he had sold them into the pyramid one warm handshake at a time, using my good name as the anesthetic. They believed they were investing beside me. They believed the doctor who had saved their lives was watching their money. Every dollar of their trust was a dollar I had, without ever knowing it, helped to steal. That was the moment the case stopped being about Elliot's 400,000 and became about something I could not walk away from, even if I had wanted to. My name was the knife. I was going to have to be the one to pull it out of all of them. The third piece I had to go and take myself, in the dark, and it nearly ended everything. I needed the source. The raw voice files, the library of stolen recordings of me from which the machine had been built, and the master copies of the synthetic clips. Marguerite knew they lived on a standalone drive in the small back studio off Rowan's office suite, the room where the testimonial videos were produced. And I had a way in that Rowan had forgotten, because Rowan forgot everything that predated his own arrival. 15 years ago, when he was just starting out and I was already a man of means, I had personally funded the build-out of that very suite of offices as an investment in a young advisor I believed in. I had signed the checks, and I still had, in a drawer at home, the original contractor's key to the service door, a key to a lock nobody had thought to change in 15 years, because nobody remembered the door was mine before it was his. The night before the gala, while Rowan was at a rehearsal dinner across town, I let myself in through that service door. The studio was dark and cold and smelled of electronics. I found the standalone drive exactly where Marguerite had said, and I connected the copier Idris had given me, and I stood in the dark watching a progress bar crawl across a small screen while it pulled 14 months of stolen voice and stitched forgery onto a drive of my own. A surgeon learns to wait out a long, delicate closing without moving, and I waited. And that is when I heard the outer door of the suite open, and Rowan Merrick's voice, low, on the phone, coming closer. He had come back for something. A coat, a folder, I never learned what. I did not panic. Panic is the enemy of a clear field. I moved, silent, the way you move around a sleeping ward on night rounds, and I slid myself into the narrow, dark gap behind the tall file cabinet in the corner of the studio, and I made my breathing go shallow and even, and slow, the way I had taught myself to breathe over an open chest for hours without a tremble. He came in. He stood not 6 feet from me. I could hear him breathing, hear the small sounds of him gathering whatever he had come for, and I found the way you do, when there is nothing else to hold on to, that I had 2 fingers pressed to the pulse in my own wrist, out of 40 years of reflex, and I was counting it. 62. 62. Steady. A clear field even now. He was so close I could have reached out and touched the sleeve of the man who had sold my dead wife's memory as a logo, and I stood in the dark and counted my own heart, and did not move. He paused. He turned, slowly, and looked toward the corner where I stood toward the copier's small screen, which I had, thank God, turned face down against the cabinet, so that only the faintest edge of light bled out. He frowned. He took 1 step toward it, and his phone rang. Cassius. The screen said I could see it flare in his hand, and Rowan swore softly and answered it, and walked out of the room to take the call, and the outer door closed, and I stood in the dark for a full minute more, counting a pulse that had not, in all of it, climbed above 70. The copy finished. I left the way I had come, through the door that had always been mine, with 14 months of my own stolen voice riding home against my chest. Idris was waiting in the car with the engine running, and the third tide broke over both of us there, and it was the one that changed the shape of everything. I traced the structure above Rowan, he said, before I had the door shut. Sit down for this, because it's worse than a stolen college fund in 3 separate directions. He turned his laptop toward me. The first thing, the money was not staying. The entire capital raised at Thursday's gala was scheduled to sweep, within 72 hours, into an offshore holding account in the Caymans, and vanish. The closing was a harvest, and after it there would be nothing left for any of the investors, mine included, but a hole where their savings had been. That was the first direction. The second was in Rowan's history. Idris had found an earlier fund, 3 years gone, that Rowan had feed-fed into a collapse, and among the ruined names was a retired schoolteacher, a man in his 70s, who had lost the whole of his pension and, 4 months later, taken his own life in a rented room, still writing letters of apology to his children for having been so foolish. This was not the first pyramid Rowan had funneled the trusting old into. It was simply the first one with my face on the door, and the third direction. Idris turned in the seat and looked at me the way, I imagine, he had once looked across a table at men who thought they were smarter than the law. Cassius Lowell isn't Rowan's partner, he said. He's Rowan's owner. And Cassius knows the walls are closing. There's already federal attention on his structure. So here's what your friend Rowan doesn't understand yet. He tapped the screen. Cassius has already built the file that hangs Rowan for all of it. The feeder, the deepfake, the solicitation, all of it, routes back to Rowan Merrick, on paper, cleanly. When this pyramid finally falls, Cassius Lowell walks away a wronged investor, and Rowan takes the whole weight, and never sees it coming. Your betrayer, Idris said quietly, is about to be betrayed by exactly the man he sold you to. He built his cage to hold you. He's already standing in one himself. I sat in the dark car and let the whole geometry of it settle, cold and complete. Rowan had counterfeited my voice to rob the people who trusted me, to pay a man who was already preparing to feed him to the wolves. Every soul in that ballroom Thursday night was going to hand their savings to a thief who was himself a mark, at the top of a pyramid that a federal agency was already circling, and my name, my face, my dead wife's stethoscope, sat on the door of all of it. I had a cloned confession, a seam in a forged voice, an insider with the ledgers, the sworn memory of a dead schoolteacher, and one asset none of them yet knew about, which I will come to. And I had now less than 48 hours, because Marguerite's last message that night told me the thing I had been afraid of. Rowan, sensing the closing near, had moved the gala up. 2 days sooner. The room would gather, and the round would close, and the last of 100 trusting people's money would be committed. Tomorrow night. It would have to be enough. I had brought a 4-year-old back from a stopped heart with less and a clearer field than this. The morning of the gala, Rowan Merrick came to my house to film me, and I let him, because a hunter does not waste a rising tide, and I had one thing left to say to this man, while he still believed I was asleep on his table. He brought a small camera crew, 2 young people with a light and a microphone, to capture a few warm words from the founding advisor to play at the event. He sat me in Odette's armchair by the window, in the good morning light, and he coached me gently, and I performed the frail, grateful old doctor for his lens with everything I had. I spoke about legacy. I spoke about care. I let my voice waver at the mention of my late wife, which took no acting at all, and I saw Rowan's mouth curve at the edges, because a wavering old man is exactly what he needed on that screen. When the crew broke to reset the light, Rowan crouched beside the chair to murmur his thanks, close, familiar, his hand on the armrest inches from mine, and I leaned toward him as though to say something fond, and I brought my mouth close to his ear, and I said, in the low, level, unwavering voice from 40 years of operating rooms, the voice he had never once heard from me, the voice I had kept locked below all week, the only sentence I had prepared. You stopped being family, I said, the day you hung my dead wife's stethoscope on your wall and sold it as your logo. Then I sat back, before the light came up and let my face fall slack and watery and lost again. I have never watched a man's blood leave his face so fast. Rowan went white to the lips. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. He searched my dull, wandering old eyes for the man who had just spoken into his ear, and he could not find him. I made certain he could not find him, and I watched a horror climb up behind his composure as he began to wonder whether he had heard it at all, or whether the doctor was simply babbling, or whether, worst of all, the patient on his table was not asleep and never had been. The light came back up. He stood, unsteady for the first time all week, and told the crew they had enough. He forgot his own coat on the way out, and I knew, watching him go, that I had set a splinter of doubt into the one man on their side with a conscience still soft enough to take it, and that it would work in him for the rest of the day, right up until the moment in that ballroom when doubt would no longer be able to save him. That afternoon, in the quiet before everything, I did the hardest small thing of the whole affair. Elliot called from school to ask what time I'd pick him up for his birthday dinner, a dinner I had not yet told him would be spent in a hotel ballroom watching me pull a knife out of our family. And I held that phone and made my voice ordinary and warm for my grandson, and told him to wear his good jacket, that we were going somewhere important, that everything was going to be all right. 16 years old, his whole future stolen and not yet returned, and I lied to him to keep him steady for one more day, the way you tell a frightened patient the pinch is nearly over while your hands do the real work below the drape. It was the only lie in the whole business I am not proud of. I told it for love, and I would tell it again. The trap itself, Priya Sundaram and Idris Magnuson and I built in a day and a half, and its elegance was that we built almost none of it. We only arranged the field so the disease would declare itself. The genius of what Rowan had done, the reason it had already buried a schoolteacher, and would have buried 100 more, was that every crime was hidden, a voice forged in a private studio, a recording of a consent I never gave. My name laid over the whole scheme like healthy tissue over a tumor, so that anyone who cut into it cut into me first. If I stood up in that ballroom and shouted fraud, it was the ranting of the declining old man they had already recorded, and every word would be another beat of evidence for the very failing mind they'd built their alibi upon. So we would not make Rowan defend a hidden crime. We would make him commit a fresh one in the open, on a stage, in front of 300 investors and, I intended, the people who prosecute exactly this. Because Rowan's whole gala depended on one thing, playing my counterfeited voice to the room. He had built the evening around a video of Dr. Silas Hartwell, founding advisor, personally endorsing the fund and inviting the room to commit their capital tonight. The moment he played that synthetic voice to solicit investment, knowingly presenting a fabricated endorsement to induce people to hand over money, he would not be hiding a fraud. He would be committing securities fraud, live, with the forged instrument playing on the wall behind him, and every witness in the county watching. We did not have to stop him from playing it. We had to make absolutely certain he played it confident and unwarned, and then be ready, the instant it finished, to prove it false past any smooth man's power to explain. For that I gathered 3 instruments. The first was Dr. Okonkwo, an audio forensics engineer Priya had used before, a woman who could put my counterfeited voice through a spectrogram and show, on a screen, in colors any layperson could read, the seams where the machine had stitched me together, the inward breath in the wrong place, the transplanted word, the smooth mechanical ghost under the sound, the physics of the lie, made visible. The second was Marguerite, who agreed, knowing it would end her job and might end more than that, to authenticate the ledgers and testify to what she had been made to do, and why her father's face was the reason she could no longer do it. The third was the federal one. Idris took what we had, the deepfake, the feeder structure, Cassius Lowell's name, to a contact at the Securities and Exchange Commission who had been trying to find a way into Cassius Lowell's pyramid for the better part of a year. We handed them the door. They would be in that ballroom Thursday night, in evening dress, waiting for exactly one thing, for a fraud to be committed in the open, on the record, in front of them. And the last instrument I did not tell any of them about. Not yet. Because there was one thing about me that Rowan Merrick, in 15 years of studying me, had never thought to learn the same reflex that made me press 2 fingers to my own wrist, in the dark behind a filing cabinet. For 40 years I had recorded everything. Every surgery I ever performed was filmed, by protocol and then by habit, because a surgeon who will not let his own work be reviewed has something to hide. And that habit had bled decades ago into the rest of my life. Every consultation, every meeting where money or medicine was discussed, every one of 100 calls and lunches and late-night sessions with Rowan Merrick over 15 years I had recorded them, quietly, lawfully, in a one-party state, and archived them, and never once needed a single one. Until now. The night before the gala, I sat alone, and went through 15 years of Rowan's own true voice, and I found them. The promises of impossible returns, the private admissions, the offhand cruelties about the very clients he was courting. Not a machine's forgery of a man. The man himself, in his own unaltered voice, convicting himself across a decade and a half. I built them into a single sequence, in order, and I did not tell my crew, because some closings a surgeon makes with his own hand. The gala was held in the mirrored ballroom of a downtown hotel, 300 people in evening dress beneath chandeliers, and I made my entrance exactly as Rowan had scripted it, because I had let him keep the script. I came in slow, on Elliot's arm, an old man in a good suit with a tremor in his step and a vague warmth in his eyes, and I let Rowan install me at the head table like a treasured heirloom. He was radiant. He worked the room, and I watched him shake the hands of my former patients and my church widow and my 2 classmates from medical school, and I held my face still over deep water and waited. Along the walls, in evening dress, indistinguishable from the guests, stood Idris and 3 people I did not know and did not need to. Near the stage, a technician who was not a technician adjusted a camera. The field was clear. The disease was in the room. I had only to let it declare itself. Rowan took the stage near the end of the dinner, and he was magnificent. I will grant him that. He spoke of trust, of family, of a legacy of care. He gestured to me, the founding advisor, and 300 people applauded the old doctor, and I raised a trembling hand and let them. And then he said the words I had waited a week to hear. "But you don't have to take my word for it," Rowan said, warm, expansive. "Hear it from the man himself." The lights dimmed, the great screen behind him lit, and my own counterfeited voice, warm, certain, a machine wearing me like a coat, filled that ballroom, telling 300 trusting people that Dr. Silas Hartwell had vetted this fund with his own eyes, that he invited them to commit their savings tonight, beside his own. He played the forgery to the room to take their money. He committed the crime in the open, on the record, in front of the people who prosecute it, and he smiled while he did it. The video ended. The applause began to rise, and I rose with it, not the trembling half-rise of a failing man. I stood the way I had stood over 10,000 open chests, spine straight, hands steady, and I felt the fog fall off my face like water off a scrubbed hand, and I reached the podium before Rowan understood what he was seeing, and I said into the live microphone, in the voice that had carried across operating theaters for 40 years, "That was not me. I never recorded a single word of it. And I can prove it right now, on that screen." The room went utterly still, and Rowan Merrick, his smile frozen and cracking at the edges, reached for the microphone and said, smooth even now, even here, "Ladies and gentlemen, my friend, the doctor hasn't been well. If I could just show you one final document that will clear all this up." And he turned to the technician who was not a technician, and gestured to bring up his own last exhibit onto the screen, straight into the waiting jaws of the exact trap he had spent his whole poisonous career building for everyone else. Rowan gestured for his final exhibit, and the screen behind him obeyed, but it did not show whatever document he had prepared to bury me with. It showed Dr. Okonkwo's spectrogram, because Priya's people had quietly taken the feed the moment I stood, and now 300 people in evening dress were looking at the physics of a lie made visible. There was my counterfeited voice, laid out in bands of color across the enormous screen, and beside it, my true voice, recorded live at the podium 60 seconds earlier. And Dr. Okonkwo's own voice came calm and clinical over the ballroom speakers, walking them through it the way I had once walked families through an X-ray. "Here," she said, and a red marker fell on the forgery, a breath drawn inward in the middle of a spoken phrase, where no living speaker breathes. Here a word lifted from one sentence and grafted into another, the seam visible as a hard vertical line, and here, running underneath the whole of it, the smooth mechanical signature of a synthesis engine, a thing no human throat has ever produced. The voice that had just asked 300 people for their savings, she concluded, was not a recording of a man. It was a machine that had been trained to wear one. A sound went through that room that I had heard, only a few times in my life, the sound of a large number of people understanding, all at once, that the floor they were standing on is not there. My church widow put her hand to her mouth. One of my medical school classmates rose halfway out of his chair and sat back down. Rowan lunged for the podium microphone. "This is a stunt. The man is not well. He's admitted himself. He can't remember." "I remember everything," I said. "That is precisely your problem." And I gave the second instrument to Priya, and she gave it to the room. My own archive. 15 years of Rowan Merrick's true voice, unaltered, in a sequence I had built the night before. His voice, unmistakably his, promising a retired couple returns that no honest fund on earth produces. His voice, in a private call, laughing about a widow's savings. His voice, 3 weeks ago, telling someone he never had to smile at the old man past Thursday. Not a machine's forgery of a man. The man himself, convicting himself across a decade and a half. Marguerite came forward then, and stood at the base of the stage, and authenticated the ledgers, in a voice that shook and did not stop, and told 300 people what she had been made to do, and why her father's memory would not let her do it anymore. And along the walls, the men and women in evening dress who were not guests began, quietly, to move toward the stage. Rowan saw them, and the smooth thing in him finally broke. "You have nothing," he spat at me, abandoning the microphone, his face gone raw and unrecognizable. "My name is on nothing. Everything routes to the fund, to the founding advisor, to you, old man. You solicited them. Your face is on the door. Even if this is real, you go down with me." "I would," I agreed quietly, and the room heard it, because I had not let go of the microphone. "You built it beautifully. My face on the door, my voice on the video, my good name spread over the whole tumor, so that anyone who cut into it would open me first." I let the silence hold. "You were so proud of that. You never once asked yourself why the old man made it so easy. That is the second blade. That is the reversal I had kept sheathed under the drape all week. The money you were going to sweep to the Caymans this weekend," I said, "was never reachable. 2 years ago, long before any of this, I moved my own assets and my grandson's guardianship funds into an irrevocable trust, controlled by Priya's firm, invisible to you, untouchable by any authorization I ever signed in your office. Everything you thought you drained from Elliot's account, you drained from a shell I left standing for you to rob. There was nothing in it. You have been counterfeiting the voice of a man who took his real heart out of the room 2 years before you reached for it." Rowan stared at me, and I delivered the line I had been carrying since a kitchen table at midnight. "You forged my voice," I said. "You should have remembered that I record everything." The pyramid came apart faster than any of them could run. The men and women in evening dress were, of course, from the Securities and Exchange Commission, and they had come for one thing and been handed 3, the live committed fraud, the archive, the ledgers. But the thing they had truly wanted for a year was the name above Rowan's, and Rowan, cornered and abandoned, and watching his own recorded voice convict him on a 20-foot screen, gave them Cassius Lowell in a torrent, right there at the base of the stage, before anyone could stop him or advise him not to. It did him no good, because Cassius Lowell had already prepared to feed Rowan to the wolves. I have told you that, and the moment the pyramid trembled, Cassius did exactly what predators at the top of pyramids do. He surfaced, publicly, as a wronged investor, horrified to learn that a feeder named Merrick had abused his fund. He denied Rowan to the cameras that were already gathering in the hotel lobby. He cut him loose to drown. He had simply forgotten what happens to a pyramid when the SEC is already inside it. The margin calls Idris had traced came due that weekend. The whole structure above Rowan, deprived of the fresh money the gala was supposed to harvest, collapsed under its own weight. And Cassius Lowell's careful separation from his own feeder did not survive contact with a federal accountant who could read a wire the way I read an EKG. They took him 3 weeks later. The wronged investor and the discarded feeder went down together after all, tearing at each other the whole way, exactly as men who build their houses without a keel always do. Rowan Merrick was arrested in that ballroom, in evening dress, at the base of the stage, in front of every soul he had gathered to rob. Marguerite was not charged. Her cooperation and her conscience were entered into the record, and Priya saw to it that they mattered. And I walked, in the chaos of it, over to the reception wall where the shadow box hung Odette's silver stethoscope, O.H. against the bell, a legacy of care on its brass plaque. And I lifted the glass, and I took it down, and I did not say a word to anyone. I had made myself that promise in front of that case a week before, and I keep my promises. I put it in my pocket where it belonged, and I went to find my grandson. Elliot had watched the whole of it from the head table. 16 years old on his birthday, he had watched his grandfather stand up out of a wheelchair of a disguise and cut a tumor out of our family in front of 300 people. He did not say anything either. He just came and put his arms around me, and held on. And I held the boy and his grandmother's stethoscope both at once, and for a moment I let my own hands, at last, shake. A full year has passed now, and the accounts are honest again. The trust made Elliot whole. His $430,000 had never truly been at risk, though he did not sleep easy until the statement was in his own hands, and I do not blame him. He starts university in the fall. He is thinking tentatively about medicine, and I have told him only that it is the finest and the hardest work there is, and that he must choose it for himself, or not at all. Odette's stethoscope hangs by our door again, on the shelf where it belongs, and some mornings I catch the boy looking at it. The people on that investor list, my former patients, my classmates, my church widow, did not all recover everything, because some pyramids take a portion of their victims down with them, no matter how fast you move. But because the fraud was stopped at the gala, before the closing swept their money offshore, most of them kept most of what they had, and every one of them knows now that the doctor whose name was on the door was the one who pulled the knife back out. I have had to sit with a number of them and apologize for a betrayal I did not commit but could not have prevented, and they have forgiven me a thing that was never mine to be forgiven for, and that, too, is a kind of surgery. Marguerite runs the intake desk now at a small organization I funded and named the Odette Hartwell Fund. It does the single thing she could never do for her own father. It stands beside older people who have been talked out of their savings, and it believes them when no one else will, and it moves faster than the pyramids do. She is very good at it. Idris Magnuson consults for it, unpaid, and has finally, after a decade, stopped trying to convince me he owes me anything, because I have learned that letting a good man repay a debt is its own kind of medicine. Now let me speak to you directly, because this story was never only mine. If you are the child or the grandchild of someone getting older, hear the thing that nearly cost me my grandson's future and my own name in one stroke. The most profitable crime of this age is not committed against the young and the reckless. It is committed against the old and the trusting, by the people closest to them. Using the one wound a lifetime of trust leaves undefended the assumption that a familiar voice, a familiar face, a familiar signature could not possibly be turned against you. But a voice can be counterfeited now. A face can be borrowed. A signature was always the easiest thing in the world to forge. Trust the people you love. Yes, and then verify, quietly, without shame. Because verifying is not betrayal. It is care. It is the thing that keeps the trust honest enough to survive. And if you are older, like me, and you feel the people around you begin to speak over your head, to explain your own money back to you, to suggest gently that your memory is not what it was, do not rage, and do not despair. Go quiet. Keep your own records. Watch. Your silence is not weakness. It is the last clear field no one can take from you, because a man who has decided you are already gone will say anything in front of you. Rest 2 fingers on the pulse of the thing. Find the one honest soul who will believe you. And do not let go until the rhythm is your own again. They can forge your voice. They can borrow your face. They cannot forge an honest record. And they cannot counterfeit a steady hand. If this story showed you that a quiet man is not a weak one, and that an old surgeon's patience is not surrender, then do the one thing I asked at the very start. Hit the like button, subscribe to this channel, and tell me down in the comments what city you are watching from tonight. I read every one. I will see you on the next one. Keep your records honest, and keep your hands steady.